We're all familiar with the phrase climate justice. Now, you don't have to believe everything that Greta Thunberg says to appreciate that there is a point here, that if this generation consumes in such a way that it affects the prospects of the next generation to have a reasonable standard of living, that is somehow perhaps an injustice. We might describe it as intergenerational injustice. And of course, Greta Thunberg is not the only person who has talked about these kinds of things. In fact, Pope Francis in 2015 wrote an encyclical letter. It's not a letter really, it's a short book on these issues. It's called Laudato Si, or Caring for Our Common Home. And in that encyclical letter, in which he talked about the environment and all the problems that our current generation and the way we're consuming might store up for future generations, he actually had a whole section which was described as justice between the generations. And just to demonstrate that there is wide agreement on these issues, let me introduce you to perhaps the first person to bring these subjects into public debate. It was a research chemist from Grantham called Margaret Thatcher. In a speech to the Conservative Party conference in 1988, Margaret Thatcher summed up her philosophy on environmental protection by saying, "No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. This government intends to meet the terms of that lease in full." A month before, she'd given a talk to the Royal Society in which she stated her support for the concept of sustainable economic development. She said, "Stable prosperity can be achieved throughout the world, provided that the environment is nurtured and safeguarded." She expressed concern that we have unwittingly begun a massive experiment with the system of this planet itself. Now, of course, she would not agree with Greta Thunberg in terms of the solutions towards these problems, but there is widespread agreement that there is a potential problem here and that there is an intergenerational injustice if we act in such a way that we impose burdens on future generations. But environmental issues are not the only example of an intergenerational injustice. I want to talk about a different example, and that is the problem of government debt. I've been drawing this analogy between government debt and climate change for a number of years. Indeed, we've got a great PhD student, Steve Necrosis, in the Institute of Theology and Liberal Arts, researching this very topic. But it seems that very few politicians understand this analogy between climate change and related issues and government debt. So I was particularly surprised and also pleased when the former Prime Minister of Ireland, John Bruton, gave a lecture to St Mary's, when he talked at length about the problems of climate change and then related that to the problem of government debt and the burdens that we are leaving future generations. Now, of course, governments rack up debt for all sorts of reasons, and some of those reasons might be perfectly justifiable. At the moment, for example, during the pandemic, government expenditure has risen considerably as governments try to deal with problems of unemployment and prevent people losing their jobs. And of course, tax revenues have decreased as well. It would be unreasonable to expect the taxpayers in this financial year to meet all those costs. After all, the government is trying to deal with the effects of a pandemic, which will, if it is contained, have benefits in future years and for future generations. However, if governments in normal times spend more than they bring in tax revenues, thereby accumulating debt, which is a burden on the next generation, surely we should see this as a problem. Surely we should see this as an injustice. So what does this debt look like? Well, in literal terms, It's quite hard to describe, of course. But if you were to put together sufficient dollar bills to repay the US government debt and lay them all end to end, they would reach the sun and back 15 times. Each of those dollar bills is 4/1000ths of an inch thick. If you were to make 8 piles of all the dollar bills necessary to repay the US government debt, each of those 8 piles would reach the moon. It is an enormous obligation that we've been storing up for future generations. In fact, the total level of US government debt today is $28.1 trillion. Indeed, while I've been talking, roughly 10 minutes, the US government, in an average 10-minute period, has accumulated another $86 million worth of debt. Now, of course, this year is a pandemic year. Perhaps it's an extraordinary year. But even in a normal year, let's say 2015, in an average 10-minute period during 2015, the US government clocked up $21 million worth of debt. I sometimes think that these numbers are just so high that we can't comprehend them. We like to pretend they're not there. We just bury our heads in the sand. And of course, it's not just the United States which has accumulated so much debt. The same is true of nearly every government of nearly every developed country in the world. So in Japan, for example, the government has accumulated debt of roughly 2.5 times 1 year's national income, 250% of GDP. In Greece, the government has accumulated debt of around 200% of GDP. In both the US and the UK, our national debt is about 100% of national income. There are very, very few countries in the world which have not accumulated enormous amounts of debt, which are going to be a significant burden for the next generation. There are a few countries in the world where national debt has not reached the very high levels that it's reached in the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, and so on. One of those countries is Australia, where the national debt is only about 40% of national income. It looks like our former Vice-Chancellor, Francis Campbell, made a good move when he emigrated to Australia a year or so ago. Another country which has a relatively low national debt is Estonia. Its national debt is only about 10% of national income. Difficult to emigrate there unless you like learning difficult languages. Now, lots of people say that this debt isn't really a burden. We could just carry on paying the interest and it doesn't matter. Or we just owe it to ourselves, it's often said. This is just money that we all owe to ourselves, and therefore, if we net it all off, it doesn't really matter. This is not true at several levels. Firstly, about 30% of the UK national debt is held by international lenders. In other words, people in foreign countries have been lending money to the UK government, money which will at some stage have to be repaid and on which interest has to be paid. But even when people within the country have lent money to the government by buying government bonds, this is not just everybody owing it to everybody else. This is money which is owed by future taxpayers in general to those people who have bought government bonds. For example, people investing in their own personal pension funds or who have bought life insurance policies. If the debt becomes so large that a future UK government defaults on its debt, then people will not get the pensions they expect, or they will not get the life insurance payments they expect if they die and need to provide for their dependents. John Bruton, in his fantastic lecture, also raised another point which is rarely raised by politicians. Most developed countries have been accumulating obligations to future generations of older people in terms of pension promises and promises to provide healthcare without setting a single penny aside. If a private company did that, it would be declared bankrupt and probably its directors would go to prison for fraud. But governments do this routinely. They set up systems of social security where we expect future generations to pay taxes to meet the pensions and provide the healthcare for future older generations. Now, these systems can work quite well as long as the population remains fairly stable and the number of older people doesn't increase and the number of younger people doesn't decrease. But unfortunately, throughout much of the Western world, our populations are aging rapidly, and the proportion, and in some countries, the number of younger people who are active working and paying taxes is actually decreasing. This means that these obligations to provide future pensions, healthcare, and so on will have to be financed by a shrinking number of taxpayers. If you actually add up all the promises that are being made to future generations of pensioners, then they come to roughly 4 or 5 times the total amount of the explicit government debt I was talking about earlier. In other words, maybe 400% of national income. And in fact, our Treasury's own Office for Budget Responsibility projects that if over the next 50 years, on current policies, our national debt is actually likely to rise to around 400% of national income, as these obligations to pay pensions to older people, provide healthcare, and so on, become a reality. I sometimes call this the government debt iceberg, because the proportions of a debt that you can see, that is obvious, to the proportion of debt that you can't see and is made up of these future obligations to older people and is hidden from view, are roughly the same proportions as the above water and below water part of an iceberg. So what might happen as a result of all this debt? Well, I don't want to over-egg this, but there have been some serious consequences in the past when governments have accumulated too much debt. It can certainly be argued that Scotland lost its independence in 1707 as a result of a venture called the Darien Scheme around Central America, Panama in particular, which led to the accumulation of huge amounts of debt. And as a result of that, the Scottish government could no longer function, and it decided to sign the Act of Union with England in 1707. If you look at Germany after the First World War, when enormous amounts of debt were imposed upon it by the Allies, after the First World War, there was hyperinflation, social breakdown, the rise of the Nazi Party, and in the end, the Second World War. Perhaps the best example, perhaps the best analogy with developed countries' position today is Argentina. Argentina at the beginning of the 1930s was one of the richest countries in the world. And then for a very long period, its government started to spend much more than it was taking in tax revenue. It financed that gap at first by printing money. And eventually there was hyperinflation in the 1970s. After the incident of hyperinflation and also a military takeover, the government started to borrow, much as the developed countries today are borrowing by issuing bonds. Argentina has had 9 debt defaults, and at the beginning of the 2000s, around 50% of the country was living below the poverty line, and the economy shrank by 28%, and the population went on strike in a general election because of the havoc that was caused by Argentina defaulting on its debt and having to deal with the enormous overhang of debt arising from decades and decades of spending more than it was taking in tax revenue. it's highly likely that some of the countries I've talked about today will end up in future decades in a similar position to Argentina at the beginning of the 2000s. So why do we have this problem? We don't leave our own children with lots of debt. We invest an awful lot of money, in fact, in trying to help them in their upbringing so that they can make their way in life. Most of us try to leave a nest egg for our children rather than leaving them with debt when they die. The really simple answer is that democracies are not very good at being future orientated. The next generation does not vote. And when we go out and vote in general elections, thinking about the next generation is rather abstract. It's not like thinking about our own children. And so we don't necessarily think when we vote about the next generation in the way we should. And when it comes to politicians, of course, if politicians do things which cost more money today, but are beneficial to the future generation, or if politicians try to spend less money at the current time in order that we don't build up debt which will be an imposition on future generations, this can come at an enormous political cost. But then it will be future generations of politicians down the line who will get the benefit from that. So it's extremely difficult, in fact, in a democracy to take account of the interests of future generations. How do we solve that problem? Well, some proposals have been put forward, but I'm afraid that will have to be for another talk. Thank you.